but we're now going to our keynote speaker, Danielle Tilbury. Daniela, are you with us? Yeah, Tilbury. Yes, hi, Daniela. Great to have you here. Now, Daniela, let me first introduce you as First Commissioner for Sustainable Development and Future Generations for Gibraltar, and also an honorary fellow from the University of Cambridge. Professor, you have done lots and lots of work on education, the role of education in sustainable development, in climate change. And that's also, you're going to tell us a bit about how can education provide an answer, how to disrupt education. The floor is for you, the coming 30 minutes.
I take this opportunity to thank Educate, the staff, but also the supporters and the financial aid that it's received to be able to put this conference together. I think it's a fantastic partnership, and I am delighted to know that the issues of climate change are very much a concern of this partnership. I think we're dealing with very interesting issues, both positively and negatively. Indeed, one of your colleagues was saying at the start of this, he was reminding us on how disruptive climate change is to education and learning. Where we find ourselves with schools being used as shelters, that disrupts the learning of young children and young people. And so climate change has an impact not just on communities, but also on their ability to be resilient and their ability to move forward. And that we need to understand as being a very important aspect of climate change. But my talk is very much about the other side of the coin, if we could put it that way. There's two sides to the coin. The first side is the disruption the climate change has on education. The other side is the positive disruption the climate education can actually have on education itself. My argument to you today is that the realities of climate change are bringing alive some of the important education and learning issues that have been a little bit underground over decades. They've been there simmering away, but they haven't had the front impact that climate change education is beginning to have on policymakers, on government leaders, on civil society leaders, on communities. And so my talk is very much about how we understand the influence of climate change education on education itself and learning, and how we can use this as a gateway for transforming learning and teaching, both informal and in informal contexts. So my first slide, if I may, if it works. Yes, fantastic. I have a couple of questions that are embedded in my presentation. Sometimes I'll address these directly, and sometimes they're indirect in the way that I present them. And that is, why am I talking about disrupting education in times of climate change? What do I mean by disruption? Why use the word disruption? And can there be positive disruption? What does it look like when we disrupt education and learning? And how do we understand disruption in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda? And finally, what are the signs that disruption is already happening? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about those, and also sharing with you very directly the results of the cutting edge research that has come out of the area of climate change education. There have been about 5 or 6 very recent powerful studies which have been used to inform this presentation. I'm not going to present results because that's very boring. What I'm going to do is I'm going to visualize these results. I'm going to translate those results into what it means for practice. So please bear with me as I talk you through these, but also to emphasize that they are underpinned by quite a strong elements of research and lessons learned over some years. Right, so why disruption? Well, I'm sure you're aware of the Sustainable Development Goals and the fact that the world leaders adopted the Agenda 2030, 2015, and that these ambitious goals are seeking to end poverty, inequality, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all. But perhaps what is sometimes missed is when you scratch below the surface of the Sustainable Development Goals is an understanding that the intention of Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda is not to add more things to our existing situation or to highlight things in our existing situation, but to disrupt the current trends of development, to disrupt, to change what is happening. And please hang on to those words, disruption of current trends of development, because that is key as we move forward. And the scenarios are that the SDGs, the agenda, is about learning for life, but it is also about disrupting life, disrupting the way we govern ourselves, the way we organize ourselves, the way we live and work, and how this has an impact on people and planet. There's no doubt that we are living in an unsustainable trajectory. And I'm not going to be presenting any of the doom and gloom scenarios that face us, but there has to be a degree of acceptance that we are facing a very challenging moment in the history of the planet and humanity. And we just cannot tinker around the edges. We need to rethink how we govern ourselves, how we organize ourselves, and how we live. And that also requires us taking responsibility for our lives. And to take that responsibility and to know how to act, we have to develop the right mindsets and skills. And so when we talk about learning for life, when we talk about disrupting education, we're talking about asking these two core questions. How can we change the way we live and work? And how can we develop the right mindsets and skills to not just combat climate change or survive climate change, but to get to the root causes of climate change so that we can live a much more sustainable life. So what I want to highlight here is that it is an absolute mistake to treat the 2030 Agenda or the SDGs as thematic content, because SDGs such as climate change is not an add-on to what we're already doing. If that's what's happening in your schools, if that's what's happening in your community work, if that's what's happening in your education and learning circumstances, then you're missing the point. This is very much climate change, and climate change education is very much like a doorway into how we learn and what we learn, and exploring how changes can occur. This is why I use the word disruption, because the SDGs are disruptive and climate education is trying to be positively disruptive in schools. And I'm going to illustrate what that means in a minute. But I just need to make the case as to why this is so important. And this links to my next slide. I'm going to read this in Spanish and then translate it. Tenemos que enseñar no solo a entender el mundo, sino cómo aprender a cambiarlo. The reality is that we are teaching students, we are teaching communities, we are working towards the goal of understanding the world as it is, and not on building capabilities and scenarios or alternative scenarios to change the world that we live in. And that is where education and learning is failing. If we want it to be transformative, we really need it to stop acting as a mirror or a microscope, because that's what education is doing. We're focusing so much on problem solving. We're focusing so much on understanding what's in front of us that we're missing the bigger, more important contribution of education, which is to act as a lighthouse, which is to not only steer us away from those rocks in the coastline, which are dangerous, but to also light alternative pathways for the future. If we are not presented with alternatives, if we're not looking at different ways of doing things, we are stuck in the current reality. So education needs to change. And there's all these key reports that argue the same thing. Progress is happening and there's changes happening as a result of this realization that education and learning needs to change towards or transition towards a different type of world. There is evidence that this is happening, but it is happening quite superficially or happening very much in the margins of education. So what is happening is that our learning experiences, our schools, our community groups are adapting to climate change and not transforming themselves. Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because we find ourselves in a bit of chaos at present. And so we find educators who are quite overwhelmed with coping with what's the next issue we need to deal with coping with the realities or the physical realities of climate change. Because we are dealing with discrete issues, we are getting conflicting messages from our leaders. And more importantly, our students are feeling very disempowered and are taking to the streets with the Climate for Fridays movement and a whole range of other things that are happening. Why? Because we haven't created opportunities to learn how to transform. We just make the assumption that if we're not more knowledgeable, if we're more aware, then things will change. And that, unfortunately, is not right. Our research, our educational research, is quite clear on that. So what we are seeing in education systems, what we're seeing in education strategies, what we're seeing a lot in some of the greenwashing activities that are taking place is that they are not profound. And so there are as well-meaning people are attempting to shift the agenda, we find that there are a lot of contradictions. Let me just visualize this with John Grant's quote. You cannot put a lettuce in the window of a butcher shop and declare that you're now turning vegetarian. We cannot put climate change examples or climate change science in our curriculum, in our learning activities, and then ignore the rest of everything else we do in education and learning. Because as I've said before, what we do in education and learning is a mirror. It not only helps us understand current society, but it also reflects and reproduces what is wrong in our society. So we have to change. We have to not only change what's in front of us, but change the opportunities for the future. So for me, the lettuce in this quote, it represents a contradiction that already exists in our societies, but also in our education and learning. And I want to identify the practical side of these contradictions. It says in the cartoon, I expect you all to be independent, innovative, and critical thinkers who will do exactly as I say. And we find in our education systems that we are trying to innovate, we are trying to empower, we're trying to help develop these critical thinkers so that they can create, unpack the problems we have, sure, but also create a better future. But yet our systems are not allowing, our pedagogy is not allowing for that to happen. How we do education is probably more important than what we do education on. Climate change education requires us to change this teaching and learning dynamic. So when our colleague at the start of the conference today said how, climate change is disruptive and what happens is schools are turned into shelters. It doesn't matter that we don't have desks facing the front for learning to take place. Let's use those shelter opportunities where communities are gathered together, where children are gathered together for learning. It doesn't have to be desks facing the front for us to call it education. Secondly, let's stop considering the picking up of waste or the issues which are much more superficial in education to be what this agenda is about. Let me share this cartoon with you. Hey, I love being here with all the plants and animals. It's so fantastic. I think I'll stay around for a really long time. Now, for me, this cartoon exemplifies what happens in education. we tend to concern ourselves with that container. We concern ourselves with how long that container is going to take to degrade, and to talk about the science of containers such as those. Sometimes we talk about picking up containers, picking up waste. We focus our energy on cleanups. We focus our energy on behavior change associated with dropping litter. That's not what climate change is about. That is not the existential issues that we're facing. It's the lifestyles that require these types of containers to exist, and the type of society we live that allows these containers to exist, that are the core issues of our day. I go back to how we govern ourselves, what our lifestyles are. We need to draw attention to learners not to the container, but why we need these containers that is reflective of the type of lifestyle that we are leading. So the issues are much more critical, but the contradictions also exist very visibly in the schools. And I know this is an ideal scenario of the school, and that many of you are working in situations where the schools may just be 4 walls without a roof, or even no walls at all. I fully understand that, having worked in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for many years. But even then, the sustainability agenda is quite contradictory. The climate change agenda can be really contradictory if we do not live the climate change changes that we are trying to endorse in our communities inside the school itself. We don't need 4 walls. We can live outside and actually bring sustainability learning to life outside the walls of the school. What is important is that we live sustainability, not just learn sustainability. And this is why a whole school approach to sustainability is something which is strongly endorsed. But we have a lot of contradictions. Another contradiction is, we use the word future a lot in climate change education and sustainability education. We use the word so superficially, and sometimes to mean so many different things. I just did a Google search yesterday and found 15,000 different uses of the word the future. And yet, if we are going to shift our learning and education to be more transformative, we need to understand education for the future. So it cannot just be a term. It has to be something much more deeper than that. And we face this situation, and this is just a cartoon, but it says, gentlemen, charge your glasses, a toast to the future. And everybody goes, the future, the future. And then it doesn't take long for people to reminisce and to revert back to what they already know, because the future is hard to imagine unless you are given a set of skills, unless you are taught how to take control of the future and how to create alternative futures to the ones you're presented. And that's where education must play a really important part in climate change education. We need to create opportunities for learning. And again, it doesn't have to be in a classroom. It can be anywhere, so that we can take back control of the futures that we are being presented and being empowered to actually make decisions by challenging false assumptions about the future, by understanding what's really important to us, and by learning how to influence the future. And that is really, really important. Another aspect where there's a lot of contradiction is when we look at teacher education work in climate change education, when we look at the resources that are developed and given to educators and learners too, we find that there's a focus on, again, knowledge, understanding, and values, but there isn't a focus on how to affect that change. So you have high levels of awareness, you have high levels of anxiety, especially in young people, but they don't have the equipment, they don't have the skills or the toolbox to actually do something about it, because education and learning is not creating the experiences, the real life experiences, and getting in there with community groups and living the climate change learning for real in such ways that our young people, our communities can develop those skills in action. So what we find is that educators are struggling themselves within schools to try, or within the learning environments, to try and make a difference. And yet moving forward to embrace a different future and to change the way we live and work requires change. And change is very much up and down, up and down, like a snakes and ladders game, where you take 3 steps forward and sometimes 2 steps back. So education and educationists need the support systems for them to become change agents themselves, and not just, again, knowledgeable on how to teach climate change education. So as we move forward, I want to talk about the positive things that are there that can support and address the contradictions I have identified. And perhaps one of the most powerful things that has been around for some time is this framework that was developed by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe that uses the Delors framework of learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. And that has a very strong emphasis on each of these 4 components on envisioning and futures thinking. You will see them in each of these when you download them. And if you have time to have a look, you will see how important futures education is for this agenda. And these are competencies for teachers. I actually use them sometimes when I'm reviewing or evaluating learning resources as well, to see whether the curriculum, the learning resources has elements of all 4. Are we creating opportunities of learning to know? Are we creating opportunities for learning to do? Are we creating opportunities for learning to be the type of person that supports changes and is living changes? Are we learning to live together? Are we learning to work towards those changes together? So I find this tool very helpful, and some teachers have used it and implemented very effectively. There's a lot of work with very good positive experiences of change, even though I've highlighted some of the very apparent contradictions. And there's a number of critical factors that can influence success. The whole school approach and the whole school plan, which I'll come to in a minute, I've already mentioned it. The futures perspective, I'm not going back to that because I've already spent quite a bit of time on that. The students' hands-on experience for learning in the community and not through textbooks about this agenda. The issue of shifting assumptions and the learning about and learning for, in other words, the head, heart, and hand approach to climate change education. If we just focus on the head and not the heart or the hand, we have an imbalanced approach, which can cause anxiety or an inability to address the issues. But also something I haven't mentioned yet is the importance of not just focusing on problem solving and to embrace complexity. Problem solving is too difficult to do. If the world leaders, if the technicians, if the experts haven't solved these issues, why are we burdening our young people with them? So we need to look at complexity and helping build tools for complexity. So very whole approach. Very important that we connect. By whole school, we mean the learner in the community, the learner with the different influences in their community. Be they parents, be they community stakeholders, be they teachers, and to help to bring a connected view of their learning with their living environment. That is really, really important. And there's a lot of very good work in this area, which I'll be happy to direct you to if this is of interest to you. There's a fine resource called the OECD Learning Compass, which helps students navigate through complexity in issues of everyday life. And it's it is very much about realizing that environmental issues are not just about solving problems, but the understanding how connected careers, living, earning some money, feeding yourself, looking after your health, supporting others in the community, how all of these are intrinsically connected. So that complexity is really important, and teaching young people about this is as important as teaching adults. But there are ways in which we must do this to make sure we reposition learning away from a very simplistic, linear knowledge, values, action. It's more complicated than that. A very recent framework that's come out from the European Commission, it's called Green Comp, has got some very interesting aspects to it, where it talks about systems thinking in particular, and it unpacks this complexity using other terminology, but embraces it in a really sensible way. Critical thinking, collective action, all of this must be present in our learning opportunities for climate change education to transform teaching and learning opportunities. And equally, we must create those opportunities where our young learners, adult learners have the opportunity to investigate, to plan, to carry out their actions and to reflect on them. Change is not linear. Even changing yourself is not simple. And so the more experience of change that we can present to our learning communities, the better we are going to be about learning as we move forward. As teachers, we must learn to change our pedagogical approaches so that less, teacher-facing young students, and encouraging our students to bring their realities of everyday life into the classroom. More and more, that is important. So in the end, I'm about to finish, just very quickly to say, there's 4 key things I've argued today. Mainly that we need to disrupt in a positive way our pedagogical approaches, the teaching and learning dynamics that we currently have, so that we don't have these facing the front situations. We don't need desks for our young people and our adults to learn. We need to disrupt the places or spaces of learning. It can happen anywhere. Learning can happen anywhere. It does not have to be in front of a blackboard. We need to ask questions and different types of questions. And that goes back to my cartoon with a carton in the middle, and how we're asking questions about waste, and how we're asking questions which are minutiae compared to the more important, bigger questions that will open the minds of our learners and understand how connected our world is, our social world, our economic world, and so on. And we need to create alternative futures. And that, to me, this last one is the biggest one that we are not doing very well at present. The creating spaces for learning to do things differently, but to plan for a different future and work backwards from that different future. What we tend to do is look at our current situation and think about the next step. We need to look at alternative pathways, because we need to reclaim our future, decolonize it in many ways. So very, very quickly, we must stop passing on knowledge. We need to get to the root causes of some of these issues. We have to teach about attitudes and values, but not other people's attitudes and values. We need to encourage clarifying of what our values and what we value is. We need to stop seeing people as problem and as those who need to have behavior change, and seeing people as agents of change, as learners who are not to be shaped, but are learners who can shape the future. We need to move away from single actions such as pickup, waste pickup collections, and creating opportunities for more permanent changes and for young and old to experience and see change. We need to have more focus away from the individual and personal change to look at changes around us institutionally in our communities. And we need to stop adding climate change into what we're doing. And we need to use climate change as a gateway for innovating, teaching and learning. There's a lot of sending of messages. This is the lettuce, you know, in the butcher shop. There's a lot of messaging and a lot of declaring that we're now green and that we are taking things seriously. But we need to actually understand that this is a process and that this is going to take time and that we will experience contradictions in what we're doing. And so we need to create spaces for reflection and negotiation as we move forward. Thank you. There's a lot of ideas there. I know we have a panel shortly and we will be able to interrogate some of these further. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you very much for those, a couple of those very thought-provoking, things that you told us, and I think we will have the opportunity to delve into those within the panel section, within the panel discussion that we will just have now.